They say if you're walking past Whispering Oak after midnight, you should never stop, no matter what you hear. That advice was once just a local superstition, something old folks muttered at bonfires or warned grandkids about during thunderstorm nights. But what happened to Eli Sanderson changed everything. Because he didn't just hear the voices. He answered them. Eli was 17, a loner, mostly quiet except when he was sketching. He had a fascination with old trees, especially one gnarled, towering oak that stood alone in the woods near his grandmother's house in Butler County. Locals called it the Whispering Oak. No one really knew how old it was. Some claimed it dated back to the 1700s. Others said it had been planted on top of an unmarked graveyard. But everyone agreed it had a strange presence, as if it watched. Eli didn't believe in any of that, at least not at first. For him, the tree was beautiful in a way that made his sketchbook pages come alive. He visited it often after school, sitting beneath the twisting limbs, watching the sun pour through the cracks in its weathered bark. He said it made him feel calm, like the rest of the world faded away when he was near it. That changed the night of the thunderstorm. It was early September. The sky over Butler had turned a color no one could quite name, something between green and rust. Tornado sirens had screamed for half an hour before giving up. The power had cut out in half the town, and Eli, for reasons even he couldn't explain later, decided to go for a walk. His grandmother was asleep. The road was empty. His phone was dead. But the woods were calling. He later told his friend, in the one conversation he managed to have before things got worse, that it felt like the tree was pulling him toward it. Not physically, not even with sound. Just a pressure, a gravity, something primal and irresistible. He reached the tree around midnight. That's when the voices started. At first, they sounded like wind, soft, barely distinguishable from the rustling leaves above. But they had shape, rhythm, language. The words weren't loud. In fact, they were barely audible. But Eli understood them somehow. They were whispering his name. Eli, Eli, come closer. He thought it was a prank. Maybe someone had followed him into the woods. He circled the tree, expecting to catch a neighbor hiding behind a stump, but no one was there. That's when he noticed something else. The leaves on the tree weren't moving. Not one. Even with the wind howling above the canopy, the Whispering Oak was completely still, frozen, as if it were holding its breath. He said the air felt wrong, like it had weight, like something massive was coiled in the branches, watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just saying his name now. They were speaking in unison, repeating the same line over and over. You've been here before. You've been here before. That didn't make sense. Eli had only discovered the tree a few months ago, but something about the words stuck in his mind. Not like a memory, more like a dream you're just starting to remember but can't trust. Then came the scratching. It started beneath his feet, a faint scrape, like fingernails on bark. It was coming from inside the tree. Eli leaned in, put his hand against the trunk. Cold, damp, and then the bark moved. He stumbled back, convinced he had imagined it. But then he saw the carving. His name, Eli, etched into the wood like it had been there for decades. Worn, faded, but unmistakable. He hadn't carved that. He never had. But somehow it was his handwriting. The same loopy, the same crooked eye. He flipped through his sketchbook. There was again, scrawled in the margins, Eli. A perfect match. Then the voices changed. They stopped whispering and started laughing. Not joyful laughter. Not even human. It was jagged and layered, like multiple voices trying to laugh through a mouth that wasn't designed for it. The tree began to shake, just slightly, as if something inside it was stirring. Eli ran. He didn't look back until he reached the edge of the woods. And when he did, he saw something that chilled him more than anything else. His sketchbook, lying open beneath the tree. But not the way he dropped it. It was propped up, like something had placed it there for him to see. The page showed a new drawing, not one he remembered doing. It was the oak tree, twisted and blackened, surrounded by dozens of small, childlike figures all staring up at it with hollow faces. In the center, beneath the branches, a boy hung suspended from the limbs like a marionette. His face was missing, but the name beneath it was clear. Eli. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't tell his grandmother, but he did stop visiting the tree. For weeks, he avoided it, even took a different route to school just to stay away from the woods. But something had changed. He started hearing things. At first, it was only at night, whispering outside his window. The same words, "You've been here before." Then it was the TV turning on by itself. Static, always at exactly 12:03 a.m., the time he reached the oak that night. Then came the dreams, each one darker than the last. In one, he was buried alive beneath the tree. In another, he was inside the trunk, unable to scream, watching other people walk past without seeing him. Sometimes, he'd wake up with dirt under his fingernails. But the worst part wasn't the dreams. It was the drawing. Every morning, his sketchbook had a new page filled in. Always the same scene. The oak tree, surrounded by the faceless children, always with Eli's figure getting smaller and smaller, as if something was erasing him piece by piece. He tried burning the book. It wouldn't catch fire. He left it outside during a storm. The pages were dry the next day. He even threw it into the pond behind his grandmother's house. It was back on his nightstand the following morning. The last anyone saw of Eli was 3 weeks later. He was walking down County Road 17, barefoot, shirtless, his eyes locked straight ahead like he was sleepwalking. A hunter spotted him and offered a call for help. Eli didn't respond, just kept walking. That was the last time anyone saw him. They searched the woods for days. Found nothing. No clothes, no phone, no sketchbook. Just one thing. His name, newly carved into the trunk of the whispering oak, fresh this time. Still bleeding sap. Since then, the tree has grown bigger. Some say it looks more twisted than before. That the bark has faces now, if you stare long enough. A few brave, or foolish, teens have gone out there with recorders. Most don't hear anything on playback. But one recording, made by a girl named Rachel Green, caught a faint voice under the wind. It was just one word, Eli. And beneath it, almost too soft to hear, "You've been here before." They're watching from everywhere. Subscribe before it's too late. And tell me, where are you watching from? The Screams Under Sloss Furnace. True story submitted by Daniel M., 2017. In Birmingham, Alabama, there's a place that even time seems reluctant to visit. It's called Sloss Furnace, a towering mass of rusted iron and shadowed catwalks. It once roared with fire and steel, smelting metal to build the South's railways. Now it stands quiet, abandoned, but far from empty. Some say the screams never left. That's what brought Daniel and his friends there one November night. 4 of them, Daniel, Ryan, Jamie, and Liz. Urban explorers with cameras, flashlights, and an appetite for fear. Sloss was a trophy. They'd filmed drain tunnels, abandoned schools, even an old asylum. But Sloss had something the others didn't. It had a reputation. There were stories, workers dying in vats of molten iron, shift supervisors going missing, hallucinations in the lower tunnels. Some blamed carbon monoxide. Others said something older was buried deep in the structure, something left behind when the last furnace went cold. Daniel didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in footage, views, subscribers. They snuck in through a broken fence just after 11 p.m. The air was thick, too warm for November. Their flashlights cut through the darkness like scalpels, revealing rust-streaked ladders and chains that still swayed, though there was no wind. Inside the main tower, the metal creaked overhead like bones settling. It was empty, until Jamie said something none of them were prepared for. "Do you hear that?" At first, they laughed, said it was the wind or a pipe shifting. But then they heard it too. A scream, distant, echoing, but unmistakable. Not human exactly. Not pain. Something else. Like someone falling for far too long and realizing halfway down that they were still screaming. They froze. Liz wanted to leave, but Daniel pushed forward. The scream had come from the lower levels, the furnace tunnels. He had a GoPro strapped to his chest. The footage would be golden. They climbed down a rusted stairwell, the metal groaning under their weight. The deeper they went, the warmer it got. The walls dripped condensation. The air felt alive. Then the lights died. One by one, their flashlights blinked and fizzled out. Even their backup lights flickered as if pulled underwater. Only Daniel's GoPro stayed on. The red recording light blinked in the dark. That's when they realized something was breathing down there. Not someone. Something. It was slow, deliberate. Vet. They turned to leave, but the stairwell was gone. Not blocked. Not collapsed. Just not there anymore. What replaced it was a narrow corridor lined with soot-caked bricks, lit by a sickly red glow that pulsed from beneath a metal grate. The furnace was cold, had been for years, but the ground radiated heat. Jamie said something had touched him. Not grabbed, pressed like a hand testing flesh for weakness. They walked, because what else could they do? The corridor twisted, turned, bent in ways that didn't make sense. At one point, the walls narrowed so tightly they had to turn sideways. And the deeper they went, the louder the screaming became. But here's the part Daniel couldn't explain later. The screams weren't coming from ahead of them. They were behind. Every time they moved, they got louder, closer, as if they were dragging something behind them that didn't want to be left behind. And then Ryan vanished. They didn't hear him scream, didn't see him fall. 1 second he was behind Liz, the next gone. Only his flashlight remained, still on, spinning in slow, lazy circles on the floor. They should have run, should have turned back, screamed for help, anything. But the corridor only went forward. So they walked, and the air changed again. No longer warm, but sharp. Chemical, like burned plastic and ammonia. Their heads began to spin. Liz whispered that the bricks were bleeding. Jamie agreed, but said they were bleeding names. Names etched in rust. Names like his own. Daniel didn't speak. He just kept filming. Eventually, they found a chamber. Circular. Foshed. The ceiling disappeared into black. In the center stood a furnace, charred silent. Or so they thought. As they approached, a blast of heat erupted from within. The furnace lit up red, then white, as if stoked by unseen hands. And in that light, they saw them. Dozens of shadows, not cast by their own lights, moving independently. They stood around the furnace, swaying, headless, limping, broken. Workers, men who had been swallowed by the machine and left behind. Liz screamed. Jamie dropped to his knees. Daniel just kept filming. The shadows turned, every single one of them, toward the camera. And then the furnace shrieked. A sound so loud and deep it felt like it was inside their bodies. Not a sound, a command. Liz ran. Jamie didn't move. Daniel ran too. Down a passage he couldn't describe later, through a tunnel he swore hadn't been there before. Everything bent and twisted, the walls expanding and contracting like lungs. The shadows followed. Not fast, not slow, just constant, inevitable. Somehow he made it out, through a side door that opened to the night. He didn't look back, just kept running until the air was cool and the stars were real again. They found Liz 3 hours later, wandering down a road barefoot and crying. She didn't speak for weeks. Jamie was never found. And the footage? Still on Daniel's GoPro. Still online. But no one believes it. They say the screams are just added sound effects. That the shadows are edited. That the distortion was planned. But Daniel doesn't argue. Because when the video ends and the screen goes dark, a single frame always lingers half a second too long. A figure in the background, watching, waiting, headless, still swaying to the rhythm of a furnace that hasn't burned in over 70 years. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it scream. This story isn't over yet. Hit subscribe to follow the shadows. They say if you're driving along Highway 5 on a foggy Alabama night, you should never pick up hitchhikers, especially if they're dressed in white. Not because of crime, not because of safety, but because she isn't alive. Highway 5 cuts through the quiet woods of Bibb County, remote, winding, and lonely. It's the kind of road where your headlights barely cut through the mist and cell service dies halfway through the first turn. Most people drive through without a second thought, but some come back different, if they come back at all. This story comes from a man named Ellis, a delivery driver in his mid-30s. In his words, he'd driven every back road in Alabama without much thought. That was until one Thursday night in late October. He had a late drop-off for a package outside Brent, way past the hour he normally worked. The GPS routed him through Highway 5 to shave off time, even though he usually avoided it after dark. But the skies had been clear all day. No storms, no fog, just a crisp, quiet southern evening. But fog rolls in fast on Highway 5. Ellis says it began just past the old sawmill. That crumbling building locals claim has been abandoned since the 50s. The air changed first, cold and still. Then the mist crept in. Within minutes, visibility dropped to near zero. His high beams only made it worse, reflecting the fog like a wall of white smoke. Still, he kept going, eyes on the road, hands tied on the wheel, until he saw her. She was standing just ahead, near the shoulder. A girl, mid-20s maybe, long dark hair, dressed in a pale, almost glowing white gown that hung oddly loose against her frame. No box, no phone, just her arm outstretched, thumb raised like something out of an old movie. Now, Ellis wasn't the type to pick up strangers, but something about her, maybe the way she didn't seem afraid of the dark, made him slow down. He pulled over, rolled the window halfway. "You all right?" he asked. The woman didn't answer, just nodded once and stepped forward. Against his better judgment, he unlocked the door. She got in silently, folding her hands neatly on her lap. She looked straight ahead, never making eye contact. Ellis glanced at her sideways. Her dress looked old, not vintage, just aged, like it had sat in a trunk for decades. He asked her where she was headed. "Just down the road," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They drove in silence. Ellis said the fog grew thicker, and the GPS started to glitch, showing a blue dust spinning in place. The air inside the car grew colder, despite the heater. And then came the smell. It was faint at first, damp earth, like wet leaves left to rot. Then it grew sharper, metallic, rusted, the kind of smell you don't forget. He turned to ask if she was okay, but the seat was empty. No door had opened, no sound, nothing, just an indentation on the passenger seat where someone had been. He slammed the brakes, got out, looked around. No sign of her, nothing but mist. Now, here's where the story deepens. Ellis told a co-worker what happened. Swore he wasn't drunk, tired, or hallucinating. Just shaken. That's when the co-worker told him to ask around about her. Turns out, he wasn't the first. Locals speak of the phantom hitchhiker of Highway 5. She's been seen for decades, always in fog, always near that same stretch of road by the sawmill, and always wearing the same white gown. Some say she was a newlywed, killed on her wedding night when her car skidded off the road into the ravine. Others claim she was a nurse who vanished while walking home from the old asylum that once stood outside Brent. A few whispered darker things, that she wasn't killed at all, but rather taken. Whatever the story, the pattern holds. She appears only when the fog is thick enough to swallow your taillights. Only when the road is silent. She never speaks more than a sentence. And if you look at her too long in the rearview mirror, some say she changes. One man claimed her face turned to ash in his mirror, crumbling at the edges. Another said her eyes weren't human at all, but glassy, like doll's eyes, and weeping black tears. But Ellis didn't look. He only heard. 3 nights after the incident, he says he woke to a scratching at his window. Not the front door, his second-story bedroom window. At 3:17 a.m., there were no branches, no wind, no animals, but there were fingerprints on the glass. And each night after, the same time, the scratching returned. He moved 3 weeks later, never took that road again, never worked nights again. And he doesn't tell the story unless asked directly. But he's not the only one. On Reddit, you'll find 2 other accounts matching the same pattern. Fog, Highway 5, a woman in white, and an unexplained disappearance mid-drive. In one post, a woman said she saw the hitchhiker walk directly into traffic, only for the car to pass right through her. The driver, a man in his 40s, crashed seconds later. His car flipped. He survived barely. When he woke up in the hospital, he kept asking about the girl, kept saying she was trapped inside the car with him, screaming. But dashcam footage showed no one. Police, of course, found nothing. No reports, no leads, and no real explanation. But in almost every version of the story, there's a fog, a moment where time seems to bend, Electronics fail, and for just a few minutes, the road forgets what year it is. Paranormal researchers who've looked into the stretch of Highway 5 often point to something deeper than just a haunting. The fog is unnatural, they say. Localized. Sudden. Some believe it's not just weather, but a veil. A thin point between worlds. In fact, one psychic who visited the site refused to speak afterward. But in her journal, she wrote one line. She doesn't want to ride. She wants to be remembered. That's what makes this story so chilling. Not the apparition, not even the vanishing, but the intent behind it. She doesn't cry, doesn't ask for help. She only waits. Night after night. Folk after folk. And if you stop, she gets in. They called it Dead Man's Bridge. Not officially, of course. On the map, it was just Creekside Overpass, a forgotten sliver of rusted steel tucked deep in the woods outside Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But to the locals, and especially the students at the nearby university, it had a different name. A name whispered at parties and repeated in dorm rooms with wide eyes and nervous laughter. The legend was simple but unsettling. During the Civil War, 3 deserters from the Confederate Army were dragged there and hung from the metal railings, their bodies left to sway above the slow-moving black water. No trial, no last rites, just a warning to others who might think about running. It said the bridge still remembers. Each year, on the anniversary of the execution, silence falls like a blanket across the area, so deep and absolute that it swallows even the sound of your own breath. And if you linger long enough during that hour of silence, you might begin to hear things that should not exist in this century. Things that breathe memory back into rust and wood. Footsteps, gasping, the snap of rope. But stories like these don't scare college students, especially not Reed and his group. They were 5 in total. Reed, his girlfriend Marin, their skeptical roommate Jonah, and 2 others, Callie and Wes, both history majors and obsessed with old local lore. Halloween weekend seemed like the perfect time for a midnight visit. A little thrill, a little dare, and maybe, just maybe, the chance to say they'd stood where the past never quite let go. The road to the bridge wasn't easy. They had to park a mile back and walk through a tunnel of pine and oak, their flashlights painting long shadows across the ground. It was colder than expected. Not freezing, but there was a heaviness in the air, like the earth itself was holding its breath. They reached the bridge at 11:48 p.m. It was smaller than they imagined. No more than 20 feet long, with warped boards beneath and rust-gnawed railings on either side. Below, the creek whispered in slow currents, black as oil. There were no animals. No wind, not even the hum of bugs. I thought it would be louder, Marin said. Jonah laughed. Ghosts don't chirp, I guess. Wes, holding a small notebook, began reading from a printout he'd brought. A mix of archival records and urban legend forums. October 30th, 1864, he read aloud. 3 men hung here for desertion. Locals say their screams were the last sound ever heard on this bridge. Since then, every year, same time, same date, the woods go quiet. Some say it's out of respect. Others say the bridge is still listening. Reed rolled his eyes. Or it's just a story people made up to scare freshmen. But as the clock struck midnight, the silence came. It wasn't sudden. It was like sound slowly drained from the world around them. First, the rustle of leaves stopped. Then the creek went quiet, even though they could still see the water moving. Then the crunch of their boots on gravel vanished. It wasn't just quiet. It was void. Reed snapped his fingers. No sound. Jonah clapped his hands. Nothing. Even Marin's nervous laugh came out like breathless air. Only Wes's notebook made a sound as it slipped from his hand and hit the bridge with a sickening, echoless thump. Then came the footsteps. They weren't coming from the trail or even the woods. They came from above. Slow, methodical, impossible steps, right on the metal beams that arched over the bridge. But when they all looked up, there was nothing there. Marin backed away, eyes wide, trying to whisper something. Her lips moved, but nothing came out. Reed grabbed her hand and turned to the others. Jonah was staring at something across the bridge. Something none of them had noticed before. A figure, not walking, not moving, just standing. At first it looked like a person, but it was wrong. Its proportions were human, but the posture was unnatural, like it was leaning too far forward without falling, like its bones didn't know how to rest properly. The longer they stared, the more distorted it seemed. Blurred, almost, like it didn't belong in this time or this light. Callie stepped forward, just a single step. The silence deepened. The figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It just seemed to glide, not toward them, but closer to the bridge's center, where 3 rusted bolts were hammered deep into the railing. The exact spot, Wes had said, where the hangings had taken place. Then it bent. Not in grief. Not in pain. In recognition. Callie froze. Then her body jerked violently, like someone had grabbed her by the shoulders and yanked her back. But no one was touching her. She staggered, her mouth open in a scream none of them could hear. And then the silence shattered. Like glass. Suddenly the night returned. The wind, the creak, the crunch of leaves. Their ears rang from the sudden return of volume, like surfacing after being underwater for too long. But the figure was gone. Callie was crying, eyes wide, her hands trembling. When they asked what happened, she only said one thing over and over again. It knew my name. They didn't stay long after that. The walk back was panicked and clumsy, flashlights swinging wildly, branches grabbing at their coats like skeletal hands. None of them ever returned to Dead Man's Bridge. Wes deleted the forums from his history. Jonah never cracked a joke about ghosts again. Marin refused to talk about that night. And Callie dropped out by the end of the semester. But Reed? He kept the notebook Wes had dropped. And sometimes, when he's alone, he swears he hears footsteps overhead, even when there's no ceiling, even when he's outside, even when it's not October, because some places don't need to be loud to be dangerous. Some places speak in silence, and the silence at Dead Man's Bridge listens back. They say the town of Ivy Hollow in Alabama isn't marked on every map, and maybe it's better that way. Hidden behind a thicket of dying pine trees and miles of cracked, uneven road, sits a church built in 1872. Unlike most chapels of its time, this one doesn't face east toward the rising sun. It faces west, and according to anyone who's dared to enter after dark, that's not the only thing it does backwards. The locals don't talk much about St. Lillian's. It's not condemned, but no one holds services there anymore. No pastor, no choir, just a dozen pews collecting dust and a bell that still rings, though no one pulls the rope. They say it started decades ago. A traveling preacher passing through stopped to rest in Ivy Hollow. He stayed one night at the home of a widow named Clara Briggs, and by morning, he had made up his mind to never leave. The town was small but welcoming, and the chapel, facing west, felt unique, different. By the time winter rolled in, strange things had started happening. Congregants swore they were hearing sermons they didn't remember attending. Some claimed to wake up already dressed for church, with mud on their shoes and wax on their hands. One woman, Ruth Harper, said she walked into the church on a Thursday afternoon and walked out to find it was Sunday morning. At first, people thought it was sleepwalking, maybe stress, but it wasn't just dreams or lost time. They started losing memories. People forgot birthdays, conversations, entire seasons. Ruth's husband once forgot the name of his own daughter, and when she cried and ran off, he stared blankly at the front door like he didn't understand what had happened. That's when Clara Briggs, the widow who'd housed the preacher, began keeping a diary. She recorded everything: what she wore, what she ate, what time the bell rang, and every little whisper she heard outside her window at night. One entry stood out. February 3rd. Heard the bell ring at 1:12 a.m. No wind. No in the chapel. Went to check. My shadow was there before me. She underlined that sentence 3 times. Local legend says she disappeared the following spring, but her diary didn't. It was found in the chapel, sitting on the pulpit, open to a page with only one sentence. The church does not face west. The world turns away. There's a theory, one whispered by those who study old spiritual architecture, that buildings aligned opposite to sacred directions can act as doorways or traps, that instead of guiding energy outward toward renewal, they draw it inward into something unnatural The church that faces west doesn't worship anything. It remembers things, but only after you've forgotten them. In 2009, a University of Alabama folklore class visited Ivy Hollow to document regional myths. They were mostly interested in ghost stories, faded tombstones, that sort of thing. They interviewed a few locals, all of whom were reluctant but polite. But when they asked about the church, people changed the subject. One elderly man just said, "If you ever go in, keep your back to the altar. Always." 3 students visited the chapel anyway. They recorded everything, or thought they did. The camera footage was mostly static, but audio was captured. A female voice repeating the same question over and over. "What did you forget? What did you forget? What did you forget?" And beneath it, a sound like pews shifting even though no one moved. When the students returned to their motel, one of them, Erica Levins, seemed disoriented. She didn't recognize the others, claimed they'd never met. The next morning, she checked out alone, leaving behind her notebook. It contained only one page, just a list, names, dates, and at the bottom, "Erase me last." There's no official explanation for the disappearances, memory gaps, or audio recordings. The county claims the church is structurally sound but emotionally unstable, whatever that means in bureaucratic terms. But those who know the old stories say St. Lillian's doesn't want to hurt you. It wants you to return. Not just your body, but your thoughts, your past, your timeline. If you ever go inside after dark, time starts unraveling. You'll feel like you're watching yourself from outside your own body. You'll speak in voices you don't remember learning. You'll look in a mirror and wonder which version of you is real. And then there's the final stage, the forgetting. They say the church begins to erase you, backwards. Not violently, not loudly, but gently. You stop remembering what brought you there, then where you came from, then who you were. Your body remains. You may still attend services, even sing, but there's nothing left behind your eyes. Locals call them the Hollow Parish. They smile too wide. They pray to no one. They wait in pews for a sermon that already ended. And sometimes, if you listen closely, they say your name before you ever introduce yourself. They say Ivy Hollow doesn't want visitors. Not really. But if you do come, and if you find the chapel standing quiet in the pine, and if the door is already open, whatever you do, don't face the altar, and don't let the bell ring. Because once the church knows your name, it never forgets, even after you do. Thanks for watching. Comment where you're from. I want to see how far the darkness has spread. Don't forget to subscribe for more horror. It was supposed to be a weekend of clarity. That's what Rachel told herself as she parked her car at the base of Alabama's Talladega National Forest. No cell signal, no crowds, just her, a rented trail map, and 2 days alone in the woods. She was an experienced hiker, careful, organized, and self-aware. But even experienced hikers forget that nature doesn't care how prepared you are. By mid-afternoon, Rachel had covered over 7 miles. The air was thick with pine and the warm hum of insects. Occasionally, she passed small wooden markers on trees, confirmation she was on the designated trail. But with each mile, something began to feel off. She first noticed it when she stopped for water. Kneeling by a creek bed, she looked behind her, toward the path she had just walked. There in the soft earth were her footprints. Nothing strange about that, except the spacing was wrong. They were closer together, like someone walking slower, and they were deeper, like someone heavier had walked the same path after her. She frowned, unsure whether she was imagining it. Maybe she turned around and doubled back without realizing. She checked her compass. The direction was still right, northward toward the camping ridge. But then came the second sign. Roughly half an hour later, she stopped to rest. And once again, behind her on the path, fresh footprints, identical to hers, but turned toward her, each toe pressed into the dirt in reverse. It was as if someone was copying her exact footfalls and retracing them in the opposite direction. She felt her stomach tighten. The air suddenly felt colder. That night, she made camp just before the ridge. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual chirping of crickets had dulled into a soft static hum. She lit a small fire, boiled her food, and sat beneath the stars. But the peace didn't last. At some point past midnight, she awoke to the sound of leaves crunching. Slow, measured. Someone, or something, was walking outside her tent. She held her breath. The steps circled, then stopped. She didn't sleep after that. She just waited, curled inside her sleeping bag, until morning's gray light leaked through the tent flap. When she finally stepped outside, the forest looked untouched. No branches, no signs of wildlife. But there, leading up to the tent, were those same footprints, coming from the woods, stopping directly at the entrance to her tent. And there was only one set. Hers. Rachel decided to cut the trip short. She didn't even finish breakfast. She packed up, rechecked her compass, and started heading back. But the trail didn't feel the same. The markers she passed earlier were gone. Some trees looked familiar. Others didn't. Worse, the sun wasn't where it should have been. It was slightly off, as if she were walking in circles. By noon, panic began to settle in. She stopped and pulled out her trail map, only to realize it had become damp. Somehow, the ink had bled slightly, blurring the trails into smudges. The compass needle jittered, and then she looked down. More footprints, at least 20 steps back, pressed deep into the path behind her. Once again, they mirrored her boots. But this time, they weren't facing her. They were walking alongside hers, matching her stride. She wasn't being followed. She was being accompanied. For the next few hours, Rachel didn't stop walking. She didn't eat, didn't drink, only pressed forward, even as the shadows grew longer and the wind seemed to whisper through the trees. At some point, the trail opened into a small clearing. She paused. The forest had fallen silent again. Not even the birds made a sound. And then she saw it. Across the clearing, at the edge of the trees, something moved. A shape. It stepped out slowly. Not an animal. Not quite human either. It was tall, thin, a shadow-like figure made entirely from flickering darkness, as if it were being projected from something that didn't exist. It didn't walk. It glided. But the worst part? Its feet matched hers. Exactly, as if it was wearing her identity like a mask. Rachel turned and ran. She didn't know how long she sprinted. Branches whipped against her arms, roots clawed at her boots, but she didn't care. Eventually, the trail shifted, and she stumbled out onto a gravel path. Civilization, or at least a hunting road. A few miles later, she reached a ranger outpost. But when she explained what happened, the rangers only exchanged silent looks. And then one of them pulled out a binder. Inside, photos, reports. At least 3 other hikers had reported the same thing. Over the last 6 years. Same trail, same shadow, same footsteps, reversed. None of them had stayed past the second night. But one woman had. Her name was Dana Ardet. Her report, filed 2 years prior, had ended abruptly. She had set out for a solo hike and never returned. Except, 6 weeks later, her boots were found, neatly placed at the start of the trail, facing inward, as if she had walked herself out of existence and left a path for someone else to follow. And now, Rachel had walked that path. The trail has since been unofficially closed, though it still appears on maps. Rangers warn hikers to avoid that stretch of Talladega, not because of wildlife, but because there's something out there, something that learns you, mimics you, something that waits for your footsteps to change direction. Clay County, Alabama, a place of rolling hills, forgotten roads, and silence thick enough to press against your skin. Most people pass through without ever really seeing it. A gas station here, a rusting trailer there. But deep inside the woods, far from any cell signal or street lamp, stood the Wilkerson house. The family had moved in 6 months prior. Nathan Wilkerson, his wife Clara, their daughter Emma, and Clara's aging mother, Ruth. They weren't locals. People said they'd come from somewhere in Tennessee. No one really asked why. In towns like that, you let the past stay buried. The house they bought was old, built in 1894, abandoned for decades before they arrived. Most folks in Clay County figured they were city people looking for a cheap fixer-upper to turn into a country dream home. But from the beginning, nothing about the Wilkersons felt settled. At the town diner, Nathan was quiet, always checking his watch. Clara looked over her shoulder, even when no one was there. Emma, just 9 years old, rarely spoke at all. Ruth, the grandmother, was the only one who smiled. But even that felt strained, like someone mimicking a memory of being happy. Then came the incident. It started small, stories only whispered between neighbors. Emma stopped going to school. Ruth was seen wandering outside at night in her nightgown, barefoot, murmuring numbers to herself. Then 3, then none. Clara once ran screaming into the woods during a thunderstorm, claiming someone was inside the walls. Nathan found her hours later, curled under an oak tree, bleeding from her fingernails. 1 week later, the Wilkersons vanished. Not moved, not evicted, vanished. When the mail piled up and the lights stayed off, the sheriff drove out to check on them. What he found was something that's still talked about today, in hushed tones like the memory itself might bite. The front door was open. Inside, the house was intact. Dinner plates still on the table, food half-eaten and molding. The beds were unmade. A TV was playing static. But there was no sign of the family, no blood, no struggle, no signs of packing or leaving. Just emptiness. Except for one thing. Nailed to the front door with a rusted railroad spike was a torn sheet of notebook paper. On it, in shaky black ink, were 5 words. It watched us sleep. C.W. C.W. Clara Wilkerson. The note was the only trace left. But the questions it raised were worse than answers. Who or what was it? And why would someone go through the trouble of leaving that message before vanishing? Deputies searched the area for days. Dogs refused to go near the tree line behind the house. A drone sent into the forest lost signal within seconds. Locals claimed they heard whispers coming from the direction of the Wilkerson property. Others saw flickering lights at night, like candles swaying in the dark, moving on their own. Over time, details emerged from fragments. A former real estate agent who handled the Wilkerson sale anonymously claimed that when the house was inspected, one wall in the upstairs bedroom was 3 inches thicker than its mirror wall across the hall. When contractors broke it open, they found a hidden crawl space filled with children's toys, old, rotted, hand-carved, and a single journal dated 1921. It belonged to a girl named Elsie Harlan, who lived in the house a century before. In it, she wrote, "Mama says not to feed the man in the corner, but he cries when he's hungry. I give him my doll, and he stops scratching the walls." This was written 6 days before her family was declared missing, the same way the Wilkersons would disappear nearly 100 years later. The man in the corner. That phrase echoed through every account that followed. Interviews with previous tenants, those who lasted a month or less, reported similar experiences. Cold spots in the bedroom, sleep paralysis, waking to see a figure watching from the corner just at the edge of shadow. One man claimed he moved out after waking up in the backyard, standing barefoot in the frost, clutching a butcher knife he didn't own. But no one had ever stayed long enough for it to escalate, until the Wilkersons. Analysis of Clara's note reveals something peculiar. The ink used was not commercially available. It was a mixture of lampblack, salt, and something akin to bone ash, an old form of ink dating back to the early 20th century. Forensic specialists were never able to explain it. Even stranger, each letter of her message was written with increasing pressure until the final period, where the pen tip punched clean through the paper, like it had been forced within human strength. Paranormal investigators, mostly amateur, flocked to the area in the months after. Most left shaken. One group claimed they recorded audio inside the house of breathing, labored low like someone sleeping inches from the microphone. But when they played it back, it reversed itself. Played backward, the breathing formed words. "Don't let them see me. I'm not done feeding." The audio has since disappeared. The group who recorded it deleted their channel. One member hasn't been seen online since. Neighbors avoid the property now. Even the sheriff refuses to go back. When asked in a local podcast years later about what he saw, he simply said, "The beds were still warm, but they were gone. Like the house exhaled and they went with it." A folklorist from Birmingham who studied the case noted that legends of shadow men and night watchers aren't new in Alabama. Indigenous tribes told of the Atsai Anka, spirits that sat in the corners of tents at night, feeding on fear and only showing themselves to those who could not look away. One detail seems to recur. These entities don't act in haste. They observe. They wait. And once you're aware of them, they become aware of you. The Wilkersons, in many ways, were the perfect prey. Isolated, ignored, already unraveling. Whatever was in that house didn't need to drag them into darkness. It simply waited for them to fall into it themselves. And perhaps that's what makes the story most terrifying. It wasn't violence. It wasn't blood. It was observation. Something sat quietly for months, watching, waiting, learning their fears, their patterns, their vulnerabilities, and only when it knew them completely did it take them, like prey stalked by a predator that doesn't need to chase. All it has to do is watch you sleep. They told her the inheritance came with conditions. The farmhouse was hers, free and clear, but there was one rule. A simple one. Don't unplug the television. At first, Lily thought it was a joke. Some outdated superstition passed down from a superstitious old man. Her great-uncle Harold had been the quiet, paranoid type. The kind who lined his windows with foil and didn't trust the microwave. When he passed, the will was direct. The house would go to Lily, his only living relative, and she could do with it what she wanted. Sell it, liven it, burn it to the ground. But not the TV. It had to stay on. Always. It was an old Zenith. The kind with rounded edges, thick glass, and those brass dials that clicked when you turned them. It sat in the corner of the living room like an old dog that refused to die. Static buzzed softly from its speakers. The picture was frozen on a grainy black and white image of a dining room. Not hers, not any place she'd seen before. The furniture looked ancient. The light inside never changed. And the sound, it wasn't just static. If you listened long enough, you could hear voices beneath it. The first night she stayed, she turned it off. Not unplugged, just the power knob. She was tired. The buzz had started to irritate her. But as soon as she lay in bed upstairs, the house shifted. That's the only way she could describe it. The floorboards creaked, but not from settling. They responded like something heavy was moving across them. Slow, measured, one step at a time. Then the faint buzz returned, coming through the floor. She went back downstairs. The TV was on again. And this time, the image had changed. It was still the same room, but the chair was facing the camera now. Empty. By the third night, Lily had stopped trying to turn the TV off. Every attempt ended with the same result. Click, black screen, 10 minutes of silence. Then footsteps. Then static. Then the picture would return, and something in the image would have moved. One night, she noticed a crack forming in the ceiling of the TV's dining room image. She checked her own ceiling. Nothing there. But by the next night, that crack had spread. And now there was something else. A dark shape in the far corner. It never moved. But she knew it hadn't been there before. She tried asking around. The closest neighbor, a man named Daryl, just shook his head. Your uncle tried to get rid of that thing once. Hauled it out to the dump in '02. Came home, and it was sitting back in the corner like it never left. Others wouldn't talk about it. One old woman at the town library whispered to her, "It doesn't show you something else. It shows you here. Just not yet." Weeks passed. Lily didn't leave much. She kept the lights on. She started sleeping downstairs on the couch within view of the TV. The static was always there, and the dining room in the image was changing. A few chairs were knocked over. The windows were now boarded up. The crack in the ceiling widened, and dust had begun to fall in the image. And that shape in the corner? It was closer now. Still not in focus. Just closer. One morning, Lily finally snapped. She grabbed the TV by its frame and yanked the cord from the wall. The screen went black. No static. No image. Just silence. It was the quietest she'd heard the house since she arrived. Then she saw the hallway lights flicker. She turned. There was a sound like someone breathing in a crawl space. Shallow, rhythmic, slow. The windows fogged slightly from the inside. Her phone screen cracked spontaneously. Then the old radio in the kitchen switched on, blaring static. The TV turned back on, still unplugged. But now the image was different. It was her living room, her couch, her coffee cup on the table. And sitting on the couch was her. Except her head was tilted slightly wrong, like it had been dropped after death. And behind the couch, in the corner of the screen, was that same shadow, inches away, almost touching her hair. She ran. She didn't even pack. Drove to a motel 3 towns over. When she called a local real estate agent the next day and told him to list the property, the woman on the line paused. "Sorry, Mississippi. We don't list that place anymore. Not since the last 3 owners went missing." "Wait, are you the niece? Did you unplug the TV?" Lily moved to Atlanta. Got a new apartment. Tried to forget, but she couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had followed her. One night, after 6 months, she walked into her new living room, and the TV was on. She didn't own a TV. It sat in the corner, an old Zenith, buzzing softly, frozen on a black and white image of her apartment dining room. Chairs undisturbed, table empty, but the static was louder now, and beneath it a whisper, "You shouldn't have unplugged it." It started with the thermostat. Ben Jacobs had just moved into his new rental home in a quiet Huntsville suburb. It was the kind of house that looked like it had been frozen in time. Beige siding, creaky hardwood floors, and that faint smell of old wood and sun-baked carpet. Nothing sinister, just outdated. Affordable. The realtor had described it as low-tech, a relic from the late 80s. So when Ben discovered the digital thermostat was somehow adjusting itself, raising and lowering the temperature without him touching it, he chalked it up to faulty wiring. But then he noticed the cameras. The first one was tucked behind a vent in the hallway. A small, round lens peeking out like an eye behind metal slats. Too modern for this house. Too new. The second was inside a light fixture in the kitchen. And the third was in the bathroom, embedded behind the vanity mirror. Ben didn't scare easily, but the layout felt intentional. Each camera pointed not just at the living space, but at him specifically. Where he sat, where he slept, where he showered. He confronted the landlord, who acted confused. Claimed no knowledge of any surveillance system. "Old house, probably just junk left behind," she said. "Maybe a past tenant worked security or something." But Ben wasn't convinced. The equipment was functional. New. Wired into the walls. Not cheap. And that's when he found the basement. Behind a false panel in the linen closet was a narrow staircase, steep and unlit. Dust clung to the air like cobwebs, and the smell was sharp, metallic, almost antiseptic. At the bottom was a small room. Cement floors, cinder block walls, and along the far wall, 7 television monitors. Each screen showed a live feed of different rooms in the house, except the angles weren't quite right. One screen showed the bedroom, but the bed was neatly made, even though Ben had been sleeping there. Another showed the kitchen, but there were dishes in the sink, dishes he hadn't used. And one monitor, he swears, showed him standing in the living room, even though he was currently in the basement. For the first time, he felt real fear. He yanked the power cord from the wall. The screens flickered, then died. Silence. That night, he barely slept. Every creak of the house felt amplified. Every shadow moved wrong. He tried to leave the next morning, but his car wouldn't start. The battery dead. His phone had lost signal. Not just poor reception. No signal. No data. No calls. No Wi-Fi. He grabbed his keys, intent on walking to a neighbor's house. But when he opened the front door, he froze. Outside was his neighborhood, but it looked off. Too still. The trees weren't moving, even though he could hear wind. No birds. No insects. The sky looked painted, flat, colorless. And the street was empty. No cars. No neighbors. Just silence. And then, the front door slammed shut behind him. Ben turned, but the house wasn't there anymore. Instead, he was standing inside the living room again, except the windows were gone. No front door. No exit. Just 4 blank walls, each more wrong than the last. That's when he heard it, the whir of a camera lens adjusting. A soft mechanical breath from above. He looked up and saw a small red light blinking in the corner of the ceiling. Watching. The feeds weren't just recording. They were looping. He was living inside the surveillance system. Ben spent the next day, or what felt like a day, trying to understand what was happening. Every time he moved into another room, it shifted slightly. Objects rearranged. His reflection lagged in the mirrors. One time, he reached for the faucet, and the handle turned before he touched it. The house was studying him. And then came the tape. He found it inside the microwave. An old VHS cassette, unlabeled. The microwave wasn't even supposed to play tapes. But when he opened the door, the tape was warm, like it had just been used. Ben hesitated, but curiosity won. He brought it to the basement. Somehow, the monitors had powered back on. Static crackled on the screens. He slid the tape into the VCR mounted on the wall beneath them. It clicked, then played. At first, the footage was grainy, almost unwatchable. But then it sharpened. It was Ben, sleeping, eating, talking to himself. Except it wasn't from this house. The layout was different. The furniture older. In the footage, Ben had longer hair. He looked thinner, tired, worn down. And then, in the last 10 minutes of the tape, Ben watched himself sit down in front of the same monitors, slide a tape into the same VCR, and watch. Yet another version of himself. It was recursive. A loop. A copy of a copy of a copy. Ben backed away. The screen began to distort. His image melting, warping like film overheating. Then, behind him, a voice whispered, "Record complete. Next subject, initialized." He spun around, but no one was there. The lights in the basement went out. When they came back on, everything was reset. The monitors showed a clean house. The furniture was arranged differently. The time and date in the corner read 5 years earlier. The front door reappeared. His phone buzzed. The car engine started. He ran. No explanation. No questions. Just escape. He moved into a new apartment on the other side of town. Never looked back. Never returned the landlord's calls. But sometimes when he walks past mirrors in his new place, his reflection lingers just a second too long. And every now and then, just barely, he swears he can hear a faint whirring sound above his bed, like a camera adjusting focus. Like something still watching. Something recording. They called it the Black Hollow Storm. The kind of tempest that doesn't just knock trees down, it erases roads, tears at rooftops like paper, and changes the landscape so violently you wonder if anything familiar will be left. It hit the rural town of Elkmont, Alabama, just after midnight. No warning sirens. No calm before. Just wind like screaming metal, and then nothing. For 3 days, emergency crews combed through the wreckage. The storm had shifted everything. Utility poles were buried nose first in fields, houses sat at impossible angles, and whole neighborhoods were torn off their foundations. But what the crew found on the 4th day, that's what no one can explain. In a field just outside the forest line, where no house had stood before, rescuers heard it. A child's voice, muffled, crying. It was faint, just audible enough to stir something primal. One responder described it as a sound too soft to be ignored. They followed it to a sinkhole half covered in debris. At first, it looked like part of a collapsed storm drain. But as they cleared away wood and concrete, they realized they weren't uncovering public infrastructure. They were digging into something older. What they found was a sealed storm shelter, steel, rusted, bolted from the outside. It was deep, and inside nothing. No child, no living person, just soft, wet earth. And bones. At first, no one said much. The responders assumed it had been an animal. Maybe the wind had made the sound. Stress could do strange things. But that night, 2 crew members swore they heard again. The crying. Not from the site, but from inside their hotel room walls. They left the job the next day. Locals say there was once a house near that field. Decades ago. A farmhouse. The Morris family. Tornado took them in 1963. A direct hit. Only trace left was their old storm cellar. But that shelter was never found. Just rumors of where it had been buried. And something else. In the town's old records, there's mention of a child. Jamie Morris, 6 years old, never recovered. Last seen being carried into the shelter by her father just before the storm hit. That was the final confirmed sighting. No one ever saw Jamie again. Until now, one rescuer, a man named Leo, started looking into it. He wanted answers. He'd heard the voice. He knew what he'd heard. Leo pulled county maps from the 1960s, trying to overlay them with modern satellite images. What he found chilled him. The shelter they uncovered? It didn't line up with where the Morris farmhouse once stood. It was miles off, as if the storm had moved not just Earth, but history. As if that shelter had relocated itself, buried deep beneath years of forest growth, yet still perfectly sealed, perfectly preserved. And something else. The shelter was locked from the outside. The bones inside? Forensics said they belonged to a small child, likely a girl, age 6 to 8. But here's the part no one talks about publicly. The bones showed no signs of trauma, no injury, no fracture. The child hadn't died in the storm. She died slowly, in isolation, trapped. And the soil in the shelter wasn't Alabama red clay. It was darker, veta, almost swamp-like. Samples tested showed high levels of decayed bacteria, but from human tissue. There was no way that soil had naturally formed there. Something had seeped into it. Leo kept digging, obsessed, and that's when things got strange. He began receiving voicemails, each one just a few seconds long. Static, then crying, then silence. Always the same, always at 3:07 a.m. He changed phones, changed numbers. They still came. The voice and the messages? He played them for a forensic audio analyst. The analyst returned the file and said only one thing. She's not just crying, she's calling for her father. Then came the dreams. Leo wrote about them before he disappeared. Scribbled notes left in his trailer. Pages filled with shaky handwriting. Descriptions of a stairway that descended forever. Of walls that wept. Of a child sitting alone in the dark, whispering a name over and over. Daddy. The last entry in his notebook simply read, "The shelter moves. It waits for storms. It calls out with her voice, so someone will dig it up again." Leo vanished 1 week later. His truck was found idling beside a collapsed barn outside Elkmont, about 5 miles from the original dig site. The driver's side door was open, keys still in the ignition. A single footprint in the mud, small, border, a child's, no other tracks. Since then, locals whisper about the crying. After every major storm in Limestone County, someone claims to hear it. Not from the trees, not from the wind, but below, from under their feet. Some say it's Jamie Morris, still trapped, still calling out. Others say it's not a child at all, but something older, something using her voice. A mimic, a lure, a shelter that doesn't protect, but traps. And the most disturbing part? According to archived records, the Morris storm shelter was welded shut after the storm in 1963, sealed by the state, with warnings never to open it. Not because they feared what was inside, but because they feared what might come back out. They say if you stand on the edge of Mobile Bay in early November, just before the tide shifts and the water turns cold, you might see it. Not the sunrise, not the boats, not even the low-hanging gulls fighting for breath against the wind, but the fog. It doesn't come in like regular mist. It rolls low, like smoke crawling on its belly, thick and rust-colored, almost like dried blood diluted in seawater. Locals call it the red breath. And for nearly a century, it's been whispered about in backrooms, porch swings, and bars that stay open too late. Once a year, on no fixed day, it rolls in from the water. And with it comes a sound no one can fully explain. Bells. Faint at first, distant, as if underwater, then closer, louder. Wrong. One resident described them as a church bell with a cracked tooth. Another said they sounded like anchors being dragged across glass, always followed by footsteps, and the slow, scraping sound of something heavy in chains. The first known account comes from 1922, recorded in the personal journal of a lighthouse keeper named Ernest Delaney. According to archive copies preserved by his family, Delaney wrote, November 7th, 2:04 a.m. heard bells again. Wind dead still. Water red as rust. Fog made it hard to breathe. Saw a man-shaped figure walking across the water. Not floating, walking. He stopped below the lighthouse and stared up. I could feel it inside my skull. Had to close the shutters. He would go missing the following year on the same night. The only thing found inside the lighthouse was his journal, a pair of boots still damp with seawater and the faint smell of iron clinging to the walls. Locals have their own interpretations. Some say the fog is a curse, left behind by a Confederate prison ship that sank in the bay during the final year of the Civil War. The ship, named the Belle Aurora, reportedly went down with over 200 souls on board, many of them chained together in the hold. The fog, they claim, is the breath of those who drowned, coming back once a year to search for their chains. Others believe it's older. A native Choctaw legend speaks of Talawaki, the breath that seeks, a spirit of vengeance that slithers across water to reclaim anything stolen from the land. According to oral tradition, Mobile Bay was once a sacred fishing ground, desecrated by outsiders who buried their dead along its banks. The red mist, they say, is a warning, not from the dead, but from something older that doesn't want to share. But legends aside, the most disturbing accounts don't come from history. They come from now, from people who thought they were alone. A local fisherman named Jordan C. submitted his story to a regional paranormal forum in 2017. He claimed that during his solo trip off the bay that November, his engine died around 3 a.m. He described an unnatural stillness. No wind, no insects, no birds. Then came the fog. Not white, not gray, but red like thin soup, thick enough to smear on his windshield. He heard bells, then footsteps on his boat deck. But he was alone. He ran below, locked the cabin door, and waited with a flare gun in hand. For over an hour, he swore he heard dragging chains moving slowly, circling his vessel. When the sun rose, the fog vanished, and his engine started without issue. But the deck was covered in wet, muddy footprints. Bare feet, too many to count. Jordan moved inland within a month. His post was deleted a week later. Another account comes from a young couple who'd just moved into a bayside home in 2020. They claimed the fog rolled in while they were unpacking. Neither of them noticed until the inside of their windows began to drip red condensation. At first, they thought it was mold or a leak. But when they touched it, the moisture smeared like thin blood. They said the sound of bells filled the house, though none were nearby. No church, no tower, not even a wind chime. Then the footsteps. They came from the attic. When police arrived, there was no sign of forced entry. But the officers noted something strange in their report. A rusted iron shackle hanging from a ceiling beam in the attic crawl space, embedded into the wood, decades old. The couple moved out within days. That house has remained vacant ever since. There's a pattern to the fog, if you look close enough. Every documented event takes place between 2 and 4 a.m., always in November, always on a night with no wind, and always near the waterline. The bells are always first, then the footsteps, then the chains. No one ever reports seeing a clear figure. Only silhouettes, shapes in a mist, sometimes tall, other times hunched or dragging. Some say they saw one, others say 3. But what's consistent is the feeling, the breathlessness, the sense of being watched. The smell, always metallic like rust and seawater. One marine biologist attempted to debunk the fog in 2015, claiming it was caused by a rare convergence of red tide algae and chemical runoff. He died a year later of unexplained respiratory failure. His lab notes contained a final entry written in red ink. It wasn't algae. It was moving against the wind. That same year, tourists at a beach wedding captured an accidental video on their phones. A sweeping shot of the coastline, followed by a strange red mist rolling in across the water. Then the sound of bells, captured faintly under the wind. The footage was posted, then removed, re-uploaded, then deleted again. The last frame of the video shows something near the shoreline. A shadow, too tall, too still. Commenters argued whether it was real. A trick of the light, lens flare. But those from Mobile didn't argue. They just said, it's back. If you visit the bay now, it looks ordinary. Still, peaceful, quiet. But don't be fooled. Every year, without fail, the fog returns. And when it does, people change. Some report vivid nightmares for weeks after. Others become reclusive, claiming to hear bells in their sleep. A few, just a few, go missing. No one talks about them. Not officially. But ask the locals, and they'll say the same thing. They heard the chains too long. Once you hear them, they follow you home. It was supposed to be a routine assignment. Just a clipboard, a street list, and a small suburban loop on the outskirts of Montgomery, Alabama. That's what Thomas had been told when the Census Bureau assigned him to follow up on a few addresses that had gone unverified during the initial mail-in phase. He was a quiet man, reliable, mid-40s, divorced, the kind of guy who still used a flip phone and read paperback thrillers on his lunch breaks. A guy who noticed things. So when he pulled into the strangely pristine subdivision marked Valewood, he noticed a lot. For one, the air felt heavier the moment he turned past the rusted gate. Not humid. Alabama summer was already humid, but dense. Like walking underwater. Like something was pressing down on him. The houses were nearly identical. Wide lawns, pale gray siding, flower beds without weeds. But there were no people. Not a single car in any driveway. No kids. No dogs barking. No wind chimes. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was clinical. He told himself maybe it was just a retirement community or one of those newly built developments not yet filled. But as he stepped out of the car, clipboard in hand, he noticed something else. Every house had 5 visible doors. That's 1 front door, 1 back door, the garage entry, and 2 side entries. Except, on every house, there was a 6th, flush against the back wall, barely visible between thorny hedges or stacked wood piles, was a narrow, unpainted door. No knob, no window. Just a plain rectangle sealed into the structure like it had been added as an afterthought. And everyone was locked from the inside. He knocked on the first house. No answer. Second house, same. The third house's mailbox had a stack of envelopes inside, all unmarked. The addresses were printed in ink that shimmered slightly under the sun, like it was never meant to be seen for long. By the time he reached the 8th house, his nerves were flickering. He turned, half expecting someone to be watching from a window. All the blinds were shut, except one. A single slat on the 2nd floor of house number 11 had been peeled open, just slightly. As he stared, it snapped shut. Fust, he called out. No response. Still trying to follow protocol, he jotted down his findings and approached the next property. That's when he noticed a shift. The houses ahead weren't quite identical anymore. They were similar, yes, but each was subtly wrong. One porch light hung just a few inches too low. Another roof sloped oddly, as if melted under heat. Some windows were bricked up entirely. And that extra door, it was changing. The 11th house's 6th door wasn't on the back anymore. It was on the side, and wider than before. He didn't remember that. He stepped closer. The paint around the door frame was blistered. Faint black streaks ran down from the top, like smoke residue or something older. There were symbols etched into the wood. Circles inside triangles. Long vertical lines that bent halfway down. He touched the doorknob. It was warm. Then something knocked from the inside. Not a random creak or settling sound. A direct, measured knock. 3 times, as if it was waiting for him to answer. He backed away, heart pounding. He told himself it was just an old pipe or a raccoon. But deep down, Thomas knew when something was wrong. He had worked hurricanes and power outages, seen the chaos of real emergency zones. This was not that. This was something else. Still, he kept going. He had to finish the loop. He counted doors. 22 houses so far, and every one had that 6th unnatural door. On house number 23, something was waiting for him on the porch. Not a person. A mirror. An old, standing mirror leaned against the siding, angled slightly upward. Its surface was warped, like it had been pulled from a fire. But Thomas could see his reflection. Except, it wasn't reflecting what was behind him. In the mirror, the neighborhood looked different. The skies were red, the houses twisted, and there were people, dozens of them, standing silently on the lawns, all staring in his direction. None of them moved. He turned to look behind him. Nothing, just the empty street. But when he looked back at the mirror, they were closer, just behind his shoulder now. One of them lifted an arm. Slowly, deliberately, the reflection of the figure pointed toward the 6th door. He left, ran. He made it to his car, started it, and peeled out of Valewood so fast he didn't realize he had dropped his clipboard until he was already halfway down the highway. He didn't care. He filed his report incomplete, said the area was inaccessible, possibly condemned. No follow-up was ever made. But here's the part that still haunts him. Weeks later, he received a standard census data packet in the mail. Inside was a summary of neighborhoods recently updated. One entry caught his eye: Valewood Subdivision, 24 occupied residences. Census verified. That was strange. He had only counted 23 houses. He stared at the paper, confused, until he noticed a footnote below the count. Door data, 144 counted. He did the math. 23 houses. 6 doors each. 138 doors total. But the form listed 144. That meant one house had 6 extra doors. Or maybe one of those doors had opened, and someone or something had counted him. They thought the isolation would be healing. After the burnout of back-to-back work weeks and a chaotic life in the city, Jordan and Elise booked a remote Airbnb tucked deep within the Bankhead National Forest. The listing was vague, just a few wide-angle shots of a wooden cabin surrounded by endless pine, but the reviews were glowing. Words like peaceful, restorative, and surprisingly quiet appeared over and over. There was no exact address, just coordinates and a cryptic note from the host. Cell signal may drop after the 3rd mile. Trust your GPS. The key will be waiting for you. They arrived just before dusk. The gravel path was so overgrown it had swallowed the tires, and the trees had grown so thick they seemed to bend overhead, swallowing the last rays of sunlight. By the time the cabin came into view, it was almost completely dark. It stood oddly tall, built from rotting, pitch-black wood that seemed too damp for the season. The air was heavy, vet. Still, Jordan stepped up to the porch and froze. The doormat was damp, like it had just rained. But it hadn't. Not for days, according to the forecast. And sitting neatly at the base of the front door was a brass key, still warm. They unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of pine and something else, something metallic, old and sour. The inside was cleaner than expected, with polished floors and minimal furniture. A wood stove sat in the corner, and the only source of light was a single yellow bulb dangling from the ceiling. There was no television, no Wi-Fi, just a worn bookshelf and a journal on the nightstand. Elise flipped through the journal. It was filled with random guest comments and thoughts. The silence is deeper than I expected. I didn't sleep the first night. The house, it exhales. Ignore the creaking. It's just the wood settling. Right? She laughed nervously and closed it. That first night, Jordan was the one who noticed it. Just before sleep, he held his breath. And something else continued breathing. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like air being pushed through lungs. He nudged Elise. Do you hear that? She did, but she didn't want to admit it. They told themselves it was the heater, the wind, the trees settling against the walls. They said anything they could to make it feel less strange, less alive. But the sound didn't stop. It got louder the second night, deeper, like whatever was breathing was closer to the walls. Like the whole cabin expanded ever so slightly with each inhale and shrank again with every exhale. Elise swore she saw the ceiling pulse once, just a subtle ripple in the wood grain. At 2:13 a.m., Jordan woke up gasping, not from a dream, from a sensation. He said the air had thickened, that it felt like the room had swallowed his breath. She didn't understand what he meant until the next night. That's when the cabin started mimicking them. When they opened the fridge, the stove let out a sound like a sigh. When Elise walked barefoot across the floor, the walls gave a soft, almost imperceptible groan, as if recognizing her steps. On the 4th morning, the couple found all their belongings rearranged. Not ransacked, just placed differently. Jordan's watch was inside the bread box. Elise's phone, which had long since lost signal, was sitting neatly on the edge of the bathtub, recording a black screen and silence. 2 hours of it. They were being watched. No studied. They tried to leave that afternoon. Packed bags. Rushed through the trees toward their car. But when they got to the gravel road, it wasn't there. There was no road. Just forest. Thick. Endless. They backtracked in a panic. That's when the GPS stopped working altogether. The blue dot spun endlessly, refusing to orient itself. It was as if the forest had moved. No matter how far they walked, The trail led them back to the cabin. Waiting, breathing. That night, the couple didn't sleep. They sat upright, holding hands in the dark, watching the walls ripple with unseen movement. Then, just after midnight, the cabin spoke. Not in words, but in pressure. The floor bulged upward in the center, as if something huge was pushing beneath it. The lights dimmed and brightened in rhythm with the breathing, and the ceiling began to lower. Slowly. "In." Elise screamed. Jordan ran to the front door, but it was gone. Not locked. Gone. Just more wall. Where the exit had been, there was now only timber. Solid. Pulsing. Alive. They ran to the windows. Same thing. No glass. Just smooth, unbroken walls, as if the house had healed its openings. As if it no longer wanted to be entered or exited. The stove clicked on. The walls grew warmer. Not from heat. From body temperature. The whole structure was warm like flesh. Elise pressed her ear to the wall and froze. Behind the wood, she could hear it. Not breathing anymore. A heartbeat. Slow. Heavy. And accelerating. It had them now. Jordan tried to break the bookshelf. Tore through the spines of moldy novels and guest logs. Found something behind it. A panel. He clawed it open and found a narrow crawl space. Too small for both of them. Without thinking, he shoved Elise in. Told her to go. Promised he'd find another way. She resisted. Screamed. But he pushed her through. The panel slammed shut on its own. She was in complete darkness. Crawling. Crying. Listening as the sound of the cabin's heartbeat faded behind her. Then something moved ahead. A light. She reached it, clawing her way out into sunlight. She was back outside, at the edge of the forest. Her car was there. The road was there. But Jordan wasn't. She ran back toward the cabin. Nothing. Just trees. As if it had never been there at all. But the breathing didn't stop. Even in the daylight, even miles away. Elise sometimes wakes in the night and swears she can feel it. The same rhythm. In her walls. In her floor. In her lungs. The cabin was never just a place. It was a thing. And it only needed one of them. Now it waits again. Somewhere in Alabama's endless forest. Quiet. Unmarked. Hidden from maps and untouched by time. And when it finds its next guest, it will breathe again. Hungry. Slow. Alive. Thanks for watching. Comment where you're from. I want to see how far the darkness has spread. Don't forget to subscribe for more horror.